Marcus Steele Davidson had been riding with the Hells Angels for 18 years, but nothing in that time had prepared him for the sound that stopped him cold in the hallway of Oakmont Middle School. It was 1:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon in November, and Marcus had decided to surprise his 12-year-old son, Dylan, with tickets to the motorcycle show that weekend. He'd cleared it with the front office, gotten his visitor badge, and was making his way to room 214 when he heard a voice that made every protective instinct in his body flare to life. The voice was coming from inside Dylan's classroom, sharp and laced with mockery. Marcus slowed his approach, his boots silent on the polished floor as he moved closer to the partially open door. Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time paying attention, you wouldn't be such a disappointment to everyone in this room. The words came from Coach Bradley Kemper, the 8th grade physical education teacher who also taught a health class that Dylan had been moved into due to scheduling conflicts. Marcus had met Coach Kemper once during orientation, a man in his late 30s with the build of a former athlete, and a handshake that tried too hard to prove something. Through the door's window, Marcus could see his son standing at the front of the classroom, his shoulders hunched, his head down. Dylan was a quiet kid, thoughtful and kind, the type who brought home injured birds and spent his allowance on books about space exploration. For the past 2 months, he'd been different, withdrawn. His grades had dropped. He'd stopped talking about school entirely, and when Marcus asked questions, Dylan would just shrug and say everything was fine. But Marcus knew his son, and he knew fine didn't look like this. A 12-year-old boy trying to make himself invisible while an adult twice his size stood over him with barely concealed contempt. "Well," Coach Kemper demanded, "do you have anything to say for yourself, or are you going to stand there looking pathetic?" Dylan's voice was barely audible. "I'm sorry, I'll do better." "You've been saying that for weeks. Sorry doesn't cut it anymore." The coach turned to address the class. "This is what happens when you don't take your education seriously. You become a burden to everyone around you." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A girl near the window looked down at her desk, deliberately avoiding eye contact. A boy in the front row had his fists clenched, his jaw tight, like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Marcus felt his hands curl into fists. The visitor badge clipped to his leather vest suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every muscle in his body tensed as he watched Coach Kemper circle Dylan like a predator, his voice dripping with disdain as he continued to tear down a child who was clearly already struggling. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't teaching. This was something else entirely. Something Marcus recognized from his own childhood, from the bullies he'd faced, from the adults who'd abused their power because they could. Marcus reached for the door handle, his jaw set, his eyes locked on the man who had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. Marcus didn't knock. He simply pushed the door open and stepped inside, his 6'2" frame filling the doorway, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. 25 students turned to look at him. Coach Kemper's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his face before he quickly arranged his features into a professional mask. "Can I help you?" Kemper asked, his tone suggesting he was annoyed by the interruption. Marcus ignored the question. His eyes found Dylan, who looked up with an expression that combined shock, relief, and something that looked uncomfortably like shame. Marcus crossed the room in 4 long strides, moving past the rows of desks until he stood beside his son. "Get your things," Marcus said quietly. "We're leaving." Dylan didn't hesitate. He moved immediately to his desk, shoving his notebook and pencil case into his backpack with trembling hands. The other students watched in absolute silence, the air thick with tension. Coach Kemper recovered his voice. "Excuse me, You can't just walk into my classroom and remove a student. There are procedures. If you have concerns, you need to schedule a meeting with—" Marcus finally looked at him. Really looked at him. And in that look was a complete understanding of exactly who Coach Kemper was and what he'd been doing to these kids when no one was watching. "I know what I saw," Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. "I know what I heard. And my son is done here." He rested a hand gently on Dylan's shoulder as the boy finished packing. Dylan looked up at his father, and Marcus saw something in those eyes that broke his heart. Hope mixed with fear, like Dylan wanted to believe this nightmare might actually be ending but didn't dare trust it yet. Coach Kemper's face flushed red. "This is completely inappropriate. I was in the middle of a lesson, addressing a behavioral issue with—" "We're done talking," Marcus interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He guided Dylan toward the door, one hand still resting protectively on his son's shoulder. As they passed through the doorway, Coach Kemper called after them, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "This isn't over. There will be consequences for this disruption. You can't just—" Marcus paused in the doorway and turned back. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, didn't need to. He simply looked at Coach Kemper with eyes that had seen hard things in life and said, "You're right. This isn't over." Then he walked his son down that hallway, past colorful bulletin boards and trophy cases, past other classrooms where learning was happening without cruelty, and out into the afternoon. Sunlight. In the parking lot, Marcus opened the passenger door of his truck and waited while Dylan climbed in. The boy's hands were still shaking as he buckled his seatbelt. Marcus walked around to the driver's side, got in, and sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, jaw clenched. "Dad, Dylan started, his voice thick with emotion. "Not yet," Marcus said gently. "We'll talk. But first, I need to make a call." He pulled out his phone and dialed. The call was answered on the second ring. "Hammer, it's Steele. I need the brothers, all of them. Someone's been hurting my kid, and it's time people understood that's not acceptable." There was a pause. Then a gravel voice said, "Where and when?" Marcus told him. Then he ended the call, started the truck, and drove his son home, knowing that within 2 hours, Oakmont Middle School would be surrounded by men who understood one thing with absolute certainty. You don't hurt children. Not ever. Not for any reason. Dylan sat at the kitchen table of their small house on the edge of town, a cup of hot chocolate cooling in front of him, while Marcus leaned against the counter, arms crossed, waiting. He'd learned over the years that pushing Dylan to talk never worked. You had to give him space, let him find the words in his own time. After a long silence, Dylan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been happening since September." Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral, encouraging. "Tell me." The story came out in pieces, haltingly at first, then faster as Dylan realized his father was actually listening. Coach Kemper had targeted him almost from the first day of class. It started small. Dismissive comments, eye rolls, impatient sighs when Dylan asked questions. Then it escalated. Public humiliation when Dylan struggled with a concept. Sarcastic remarks that made the other students laugh nervously. Being singled out for mistakes while other students' errors were ignored. "He makes me feel stupid," Dylan said, his voice cracking. "He says I'm wasting everyone's time, that I'm the reason the class is falling behind, that I should just give up because I'm never going to amount to anything anyway." Marcus felt rage building in his chest, white-hot and barely controlled. But he kept his voice calm. "Did you tell anyone? Your teachers? The counselor?" Dylan shook his head. "I tried. I told Mr. Peterson, my homeroom teacher. He said Coach Kemper was old school, that his methods were tough but effective, and that I probably just needed to work harder." Dylan's hands twisted together on the table. I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I was just being too sensitive. No, Marcus said firmly, moving to sit across from his son at the table. No, Dylan. What that man is doing to you, that's not teaching. That's abuse. And you are not the problem. Do you understand me? Dylan's eyes filled with tears, and Marcus reached across the table to grip his son's hand. I should have seen it sooner. I should have known something was wrong. I didn't want to worry you, Dylan whispered. You work so hard, and I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just tried harder. Listen to me, Marcus said, his voice gentle but absolute in its certainty. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. That man failed you. The school failed you. I failed you by not seeing it sooner. But that ends today. You understand? You are never going back to that classroom. Never. Relief flooded Dylan's face, followed immediately by a new worry. But what about school? I can't just quit. And everyone's going to know, and they're going to think. They're going to know that your father protects you, Marcus said. They're going to know that no one gets to treat you that way, and they're going to learn that actions have consequences. His phone buzzed. A text from Hammer. Brothers are mobilizing. ETA 90 minutes. How many you think we'll get? Marcus typed back. Enough to make sure they can't ignore this. He had no idea that within 2 hours, 97 Hell's Angels would be standing in that school parking lot, or that what started as one father protecting his son would become a catalyst for systemic change that would affect thousands of students across 3 school districts. All he knew was that Dylan was safe now, and that was all that mattered. If you believe in the power of observation, in trusting your instincts, and in the courage it takes to speak up when something feels wrong, then pause for a moment. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to Bike Diaries. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story will remind you that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. The rumble started at 3:30 p.m. The first motorcycle to arrive at Oakmont Middle School was Hammer's, a chrome-heavy road king that gleamed in the afternoon sun. He pulled into the parking lot, killed the engine, and took his position near the main entrance, arms crossed, feet planted. 2 minutes later, 3 more bikes arrived. Then 5. Then a dozen, their engines creating a sound that rolled across the parking lot like thunder, announcing to everyone within earshot that something significant was happening. Inside the school, teachers paused mid-lesson, looking toward windows. Students pressed their faces to glass, pointing at the growing crowd of motorcycles. Principal Rebecca Walters was in her office when her secretary knocked, her face pale. Dr. Walters, you need to see this. By 4:00 p.m., there were 50 motorcycles in the parking lot. By 4:15, 70. The arrivals continued, mechanics and nurses, construction workers and veterans, business owners and tradesmen. They came from job sites and homes, from errands and appointments, because the call had gone out and the code was absolute. When a brother's child is hurt, you show up. Marcus stood with Hammer and 4 other members of the club's leadership, watching as more brothers continued to arrive. The school resource officer, Officer Martinez, emerged from the building, his hand resting on his radio, but not yet calling for backup. Marcus, Officer Martinez said carefully. He'd worked with the community long enough to know escalation would only make things worse. What's going on? My son has been verbally abused by a teacher for 2 months, Marcus said, his voice steady. I witnessed it personally today. The school's administration has been dismissive of complaints. We're here to make sure that changes. You planning any trouble? No, sir. We're just standing here, peacefully, waiting for someone to take this seriously. By 4:30, 97 motorcycles filled that parking lot. 97 men stood in silent formation, not chanting, not threatening, simply present. Their message was clear. You cannot dismiss this. You cannot ignore this. We are not leaving until someone answers for what's been happening to our children. And they weren't alone. Parents began emerging from the school, drawn by the commotion. When they learned why the bikers were there, story after story began to surface. Jennifer Mills, whose daughter had transferred out of Coach Kemper's class in tears. David Chen, whose son had started having panic attacks before school. Sandra Rodriguez, who'd complained to the principal 3 times about Kemper's teaching methods and been told she was being overprotective. What started as one father's fight was becoming something larger. 3 news vans arrived within 30 minutes, cameras rolling, capturing the sea of leather and chrome, the silent bikers, and the parents who stood with them. A reporter approached Marcus, microphone extended. "Mr. Davidson, can you tell us why you're here?" Marcus looked directly into the camera. "I'm here because my son was being abused by someone who's supposed to educate him. I'm here because the system failed to protect him. And I'm here because no child should have to suffer like that." Behind him, 97 men stood in agreement, their presence saying what words couldn't. This matters. These children matter. And we will not be silent. Inside the building, Principal Walters made a phone call to the district superintendent. 20 minutes later, Dr. Patricia Morales arrived, along with 2 school board members. What followed was a parking lot meeting that would change everything. Parents spoke. Students who'd been afraid to come forward found their voices. Teachers who'd witnessed Kemper's behavior but felt powerless to report it finally shared what they'd seen. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, impossible to dismiss with 97 bikers and 3 news cameras watching. Dr. Morales addressed the crowd, her voice carrying across the parking lot. Effective immediately, Coach Kemper is being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. We will interview students, review classroom practices, and take appropriate action. And we are implementing immediate policy changes to ensure this never happens again. It wasn't justice yet, but it was accountability. It was validation that what these children had endured was real and wrong and unacceptable. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Bike Diaries. We bring you stories that prove heroism comes in all forms, that courage isn't measured by size or age, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever noticed something important that others missed? Your story might inspire someone else. The investigation took 5 weeks. What they uncovered was systematic. 23 separate complaints about Coach Kemper over 4 years, all minimized or dismissed. Students described an environment of fear and humiliation. Teachers admitted they'd heard concerning things, but felt unable to challenge a coach who had tenure and connections within the administration. The state teaching board suspended Kemper's license. The school district, facing intense scrutiny and potential lawsuits, implemented sweeping changes: mandatory cameras in all classrooms, anonymous reporting systems, regular psychological evaluations for students, and a zero-tolerance policy for emotional abuse. But the real change happened in the families affected. Dylan transferred to a new school where he found teachers who encouraged rather than belittled him. His confidence returned slowly, rebuilt through patient support, and the knowledge that his father had seen his pain and taken action. 6 months after that November afternoon, Marcus sat on his porch watching Dylan work on a bicycle in the driveway, humming to himself as he adjusted the chain. The boy who'd been breaking apart under the weight of daily cruelty was healing, rediscovering the joy of simply being 12 years old. Dylan looked up, caught his father watching, and grinned. "Dad, want to take a ride when I'm done?" There's a new trail by the lake. Marcus smiled. Yeah, son, I'd like that. As they rode that afternoon, Dylan chatting easily about school and friends and the science project he was excited about, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. His son was safe. His son was happy. His son knew that when something was wrong, speaking up mattered. That was worth everything. Worth the confrontation, worth calling in 97 of his brothers, worth standing in that parking lot until someone listened. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show up for someone who can't fight for themselves. The story went viral, shared millions of times across social media. Parents in other communities saw what had happened and found their own courage to demand accountability. Similar movements emerged in different districts. The Hells Angels chapters nationwide began partnering with child advocacy organizations, showing up at school board meetings, standing with families fighting institutional failures. The brotherhood that society had often viewed with suspicion became associated with protection and justice. Those 97 bikers didn't just show up for Dylan. They showed up for every child who'd felt powerless, every parent who'd been dismissed, every family that needed someone to stand with them. Their presence said something profound. You are not alone. Your children matter, and we will not be silent when the vulnerable are being harmed. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you to trust your instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to never underestimate the power of paying attention, please share it. Subscribe to Bike Diaries for more stories that prove heroes are everywhere. Courage comes in all forms, and sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest impact. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done in Marcus's place? Marcus never set out to be a hero or start a movement. He simply refused to look away when his son was suffering. And that simple act of showing up, of being present, of paying attention, and refusing to accept unacceptable treatment of his child, changed everything. Not just for Dylan, but for hundreds of children whose parents found their own courage in his example. Because sometimes one person standing up is all it takes to remind a community of its power. And sometimes 97 brothers standing together is exactly what it takes to make institutions listen. If you believe children deserve better, if you believe parents have the right to demand accountability, if you believe communities can force change when they stand together, then this story is for you. Your voice matters, your instincts matter, and when you stand up for what's right, you're never standing alone.